today we have the legendary Jeremy Hochman from Megapixel, who is going to talk all about the things that you need to know before you jump on your next VR project. So, you can use this microphone.
Thanks, everybody. As Frieder graciously introduced, I'm Jeremy from Megapixel. We have been in the display and virtual production market for quite some time, some of us in previous careers, so I'll show a little bit of background. But we build the processing systems for a lot of virtual production stages. This is running off of a Megapixel system, this particular truck. And there are a lot of things that we do in a very special manner, very different from others in the industry, because we've had a very film-centric workflow for about 20 years in terms of our engineering and kind of brain trust within the company. So a lot of what's been discussed today, and I'll talk about it a little bit as well, is the future of this visual technology. And there's this merging of video and lighting, and we see this really kind of becoming one and the same, but keeping in mind that everybody has different tool sets because they have different functions. And so it's very important for us to not be changing people's workflows necessarily, but just to expand the tools that are available. So I want to look back at kind of the history of virtual production so that we can kind of see the progression and the arc that's been throughout the years. This image is from a movie called Zodiac. I worked on this. I believe this is the first time image-based lighting with LEDs was ever used on camera. I was on set basically writing code overnight to do what we wanted to do. This was, oh, I'm sorry, let me back up. This is, I forgot I had this in here. Prior to Zodiac, I worked on a music video for Coldplay Speed of Sound. We had the intention of having all of these kind of creative LED elements as a backdrop for the band, and it was all just basically concert fancy lighting to be eye candy, essentially. As we continued playing with it and starting to do pre-records and time code tracking and everything, we realized that time code driving all of this was really effective because it was repeatable. We could do take after take after take after take, and it was the same. The other thing that we found was kind of by accident, when some of the band members were a little bit closer to the LED fixtures, we were getting beautiful illumination on their faces and reflections off of the eyes and clothing and a watch and those kind of things. So we thought, okay, let's take some of these fixtures and actually build them on a boom arm, make a key light out of it. So this entire music video ended up being just RGB LEDs. This was Versatube at the time, my company Element Labs. And this is basically the genesis of saying, wait a minute, we think we could do this on, like for films, not just for kind of fancy concerts and music videos. So it was very successful for this. This was shot on film camera. The DP for this, the late Harris Savides, he and I collaborated between this particular music video and Zodiac. We approached David Fincher with the idea of doing driving plates with image-based lighting. Back then, we just called it video lighting. So that's what's on a lot of my old IMDb stuff. And we were able to very nicely mimic the, to use the word, get lighting of street scenes. And this was very effective for night shots because we really wanted a lot of contrasty things. Back in this day, the LEDs were not really geared towards being super color accurate. They were made to just kind of be pops of color, but it was still very, very effective to give a simulated environment. This happened to use blue screen, but as all of you in here know, it's more important to get the lighting right in something like that because the subject has to look correct. And so this was really successful, and after doing this, realized that this was a thing that we should explore. This was time code driven as well. So one of the actors did take after take after take after take. I think there were 38 takes of one of the scenes, and it was all repeatable. So that was able to be cut and spliced in different ways in post, and the lighting conditions were always the same, which was really key. So shortly after this, that was successful. We were then approached to say, well, can you now light up a train car instead of just a small vehicle? So this was back in 2008 for Curious Case of Benjamin Button. We took the same lighting fixtures and lit up the train car. Again, you can see there was no such thing as a brain bar. There was no Unreal Engine. This was just a Mac laptop running software that I wrote over the weekend. And what was interesting about this particular one is the plate shots that were given to me. It was a tree-lined street, and the trees were obviously green in the plate, and it was shining a lot of green light into the train car. And that was the aha moment of, wait a minute, we want this more for the dynamic lighting, and we want the sun to be the correct color temperature, but we don't want green light spilling on all the reflective edges of the train car and on people's faces. So I wrote a keyer over the weekend to, in real time, allow us to do some of these controls. So again, this was very much the infancy of kind of figuring out how this stuff works, how it doesn't work, and working together with gaffer and DP and director to really just get the shot that they were looking for. So LED panels started to get a little bit higher resolution to allow us to do more dynamic things. So the gravity light box got a lot of publicity. This was an LED tile that we developed quite a while ago, not specifically for film purpose, but we repurposed it in this case and did a lot of motion tracking, camera tracking with it with partners. And this was, again, kind of a tentpole moment for people realizing that this was really amazing for getting all of these reflections so that the equivalent of shooting in green screen gives you more dynamic elements besides just illuminating somebody with a static color and having the background. It just sells the illusion a little bit more. Then these things shortly after started to get a lot bigger. This is a photograph from Rogue One. I'm sure Chris, who spoke earlier, worked on this one. This is one of the earlier drums of LED. So you'll kind of recognize this shape. This was used for illumination because it was lower resolution than what's used today. I see you smiling in the background, so I want to talk to you about it later. But this was a really cool one. This got all kinds of nice reflections in the spaceships and people's faces and everything. I think this is the first in-camera LED that was used where the cinema camera actually was recording what was on the LEDs rather than just using reflections. So this was 2017. And interestingly, back then, so this was the train car for Murder on the Orient Express. Again, all captured real-time in-camera VFX. This was 2mm LED. But interestingly, all the way back then, this was already 2 times 8K resolution because of the size. So very early on, we realized that these things are going to require immense bandwidth and just an insane level of control that like a normal 4K TV or at the time an HD TV is designed for. And so none of the playback systems were really ready to be able to do these kind of things. And so this is where a lot of people started to kind of level up different technologies. And this was also the first time that we effectively somewhat color corrected the LED, because again, we were taking panels made for rock concerts and a CES trade show booth for a big consumer electronics company. And we said, hey, let's throw these together and put them outside the window of a train car. The colors that are made to be grabbing your attention at a trade show are not the colors that a film camera sees. And so this was the beginning of creating LUTs and matrices and all those things to conform to color standards that the cameras needed. Shortly after we did First Man, this was using kind of the genesis of our processing system. And it's again, I think this is the first drum of LED that was captured in camera. So again, very tentpole application. This won an Oscar for visual effects. And then basically this concept, as you see here, you see all over the place when people think about virtual production. So today's volumes have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. They've also gotten smaller and economical. And so I think, thinking about Sam's comments earlier today, this is not a end-all be-all one design for everybody. There are different applications. The same way if you're building a house, you need a hammer and a screwdriver and a drill and different tools. These are all different tools for people to do different levels of production and different types of shots. So that's a long time in the making. Now I want to talk a little bit about color. So when we look at the systems that are driving these things, we have footage that could be from Unreal. It could be plate shots that have been made. It could be things that Alex has worked on in Assimilate to grade plates and those kinds of things. That's going into a server that might be playing back. It might be doing 2.5D, might be doing 3D rendering. And then that's going into the LED processor. And then, of course, the camera is looking at the LED wall. All of these points are places in which metadata can fail and the colorimetry can be wrong. So I know at home for myself, even like once a month, I have to reboot my Sony Bravia TV so that it comes up in the right color and negotiates properly with my Apple TV to be able to stream movies. And this is something that in a film production has to be rock solid, and you have to be a known color space and known color gamut. And that's, I think, that's the thread that everybody's been talking about, is that there are a lot of different ways of solving the problem, but these are kind of the basis of the problems in that not everything talks the same language and not everything exchanges data in the right way. And even still with video, what's kind of interesting is, coming from the lighting aspect, there's been a lot of progressions to, from DMX to ArtNet, and there's RDMNet and streaming ACN. The protocols largely are fairly similar, but it's moved from like a 5-pin XLR to an Ethernet cable. With video, it can be all kinds of different connectors and sources. So there can be a coax cable for SDI, there can be an HDMI cable, there can be DisplayPort, there can be Thunderbolt, and they're all different protocols, they're all different types of bits on the wire. So it's a lot of things to wrangle, and as a manufacturer, it's actually quite difficult to make sure that everything works the same all the time. So we want to give people the tools to see what we think somebody is sending to us and then allow you to override it or change it if you need to. So in Helios, we manage color both for video and now with Mimic lighting. And we see this converging quite a bit. The Mimic tile, this is a color spectrum graph of the Mimic tile. And what I want to point out here is that we see the colored portions of the graph and the gradient, and then there are sort of ungradated portions. So essentially the filled white area of the RGB is what a normal RGB LED wall is going to produce and what the RGB LEDs of the Mimic tile produce. But that's not great for sunlight, moonlight, real lighting on skin, because skin, for example, to get a person looking correct, our skin is not opaque, it's translucent, and so light is actually making it through different layers of our skin and reflecting differently, and we need the broad spectrum. And so everything that has the color gradient there is essentially the added color wavelengths that the Mimic tile is producing, even though you're still feeding it with an RGB signal. So here's an example, kind of taking a step back, and we're talking about the flow of data from footage that might be encoded in a specific color space, going into a server, going into the LED processor, captured by camera. We've looked at a lot of these charts, but I wanted to kind of exemplify, well, what is the difference in red? What's the difference in green? What's the difference in blue? And it's not that the one on the left and the one on the right are correct or incorrect. It's just that these are both standards, and it's very important to pick a standard so that everybody's kind of working on a level playing field, if you will. If you have mismatches, then you don't know what you're supposed to reproduce. The equipment can't operate properly, and it probably is going to look wrong in camera. This is just a little bit of a further explanation. So when we look at the Mimic tile, for example, or other illumination devices that have more than RGB, Mimic has a cool white and a warm white. There are a lot of moving lights that have cyan, magenta, yellow added to them as well, and other secondaries and primaries. When we think about the wider color gamut being able to produce, let's say, something that's more technically correct for what a camera wants to see, or more correct for illuminating skin, we're often looking at, what does the illumination look like in a camera test? And so we see a person, we see clothing. This is like my Rec 2020 shirt. But we see how somebody's illuminated, or how fabric is illuminated, or a bowl of oranges. And I wanted to show this because this shows what is actually shining on the person. So this is, these are separated left and right, but these are actually taken in the same frame. On the left-hand side is an LED tile that we've prototyped because we do a lot of R&D work. That's an RGB Rec 2020 capable tile. On the right-hand side is Rec 2020 RGB capable, but also with a phosphor white that's D65. And you can see that it looks more correct, and it has actual white emission rather than the mixture. And so with all of the calibration techniques that are possible to do on the LED wall in camera, well, we can tune the one on the left to look correct on camera, but no matter what you do, that's not going to look good enough to light a person or light a specific real object. And so the one on the right is kind of what the mimic tile, for example, or an RGBW higher res fixture would look like if you're actually looking at the LEDs instead of looking at the results that you see in a camera test. So one of the things that we did together with KINO FLO was work on how to create this intersection of video and lighting. And so one of the really cool things in Helios is that we're able to converge video data and streaming ACN coming from a console to control down to the individual LED tile level to give both video operators and lighting console control over basically whatever they want to. And so this is an enormous benefit for coming in and be able to still being able to do a console connection, having a flash effect or strobe for a lightning strike or something like that that doesn't necessarily need to be rendered in the content. So I'm going to give a demo of what some of these color handles are inside Helios. If we can pull up maybe the camera feed on that monitor there. So first off, I want to show a metadata area. So we're receiving DisplayPort that we're stitching together, and I'll try to hopefully zoom in on this. So we read the metadata that's on the wire. So we know that we're getting a signal that's RGB, Rec 709, full range, SDR. This is really important because we need to know how is the source rendered, what's on the wire, how is it metadata tagged, to then be able to match lighting and do all of these other calibration methodologies to know what are we matching to. So Marcus, for example, showed us nice graphs and methodologies for mapping like an RGB moving light fixture to be the correct colors. But how do we know what the correct colors are? Well, this is actually able to tell us what the source video is. So this gives us the information to know what are we matching to. And I'll show you an example of what looks correct and what doesn't look correct if we mismatch these things. So I'm going to open this up. Oh, cool, thanks. The AC feels good. So this is going to be a little bit subtle because we don't have like a red neon sign in Vegas or something like that. But we have a lot of colorimetry tools within Helios. So this is showing us a tone mapper, a LUT area, and the gamut of the actual panels. So what we see on the right-hand side in the color triangle is actually a saturated triangle of the color space that we're supposed to conform to. But the larger triangle is actually showing us the native color gamut of the tile. So the tile can actually go much larger than what it's being asked to do, but we don't want to go larger. We want to be conforming to exactly what we're asked to reproduce, but I can manually change it. So if we found that the metadata was incorrect, because it's going through a number of switchers and matrices and everything, we can manually change it. So I'm going to click on Rec 2020, and hopefully we'll see, can we put the car up there? So if we look at like the mountains and some other things, we should see it get a lot more saturated. And I'll go back. And so these things happen in real time, and one of them may stylistically look better than another, but we want to aim to be very accurate as a baseline, as other people have mentioned. And then it's up to the cinematographer and the director to decide on a look. It's okay to make it not look correct as a specific look. You want to be a very cool movie, or you want to be very desaturated. But these are the kind of things that we want to be doing after we know that the color pipeline is correct. Again, back to Alex's tone mapping that he had, same thing. This is a linear system right now that's operating the way that it's supposed to be. But if I enable my tone mapper and I do a little bit of gamma and I adjust my gain and change the color there, it should be, that's a crazy adjustment, right? But we have the tools in there for users to change what they need to do to make it look the way they want to look for the specific environmental shot. Now, there are a lot of places that you can make these kinds of changes. You can do it in an engine, you can do it in Resolve for playback, you can do it in Helios. And it's not that any one of those places is right or wrong, but you should have one place that's sort of your truth, where you say, we're working in Rec 709 today, or we're working in Rec 2020, and you want to know that everything has a baseline to hit those colors. And then again, stylistically, if somebody's really comfortable using Palmfort or Assimilate, or they're really comfortable using Helios directly, or they're really comfortable using Unreal, that's great. Make the adjustments where you're most comfortable doing it. But the baseline is very important to get right everywhere, so that you're not kind of moving rubber bands upon rubber bands. Otherwise, it gets really difficult to kind of chase everything around. So I'll stop here related to color, and then I want to show one other piece, because I was talking about some of the kind of DMX and streaming ACN controls. So we have a whole streaming ACN engine that allows for a lighting console to send data directly into Helios. You can control things like blackout and global RGB, but we also give the ability now for additive color mixing. So you're not needing to necessarily colorize whatever's existing in the video. If somebody says, hey, I want a light card that's bright green, you can just go and actually self-generate the green in the tile, and that's very easy to do with all of the fixtures as they get mapped. So I'll try to zoom in here. The Mimic tiles are much lower resolution than the others, but let's take maybe our key here. So we have this little pop-up that'll come up. This is where you can enable streaming ACN for a particular grouping of tiles, or even individual tiles. And I'll make a pretty large adjustment on one of these. I don't know which one it's doing. Maybe we'll put the video up there. Yeah, so now you can see there's a lot of magenta light on the headlight of the car. So that's potentially incorrect, but all of these adjustments you can be doing directly in a lighting console instead of having to go into the LED processor. We have the handles here as well if there isn't a board operator, or if it's something that you want to be doing in video handles. So a couple things for follow-up. We have this entire UI that I was driving. I don't want to turn this into like a training session of Helios, but this is actually available as a cloud instance. So anybody that wants to play with this, you can scan this QR. You'll be asked basically to sign up with your email, and then you can use this at any time, 24/7, and just play around with it. And I definitely I recommend that everybody plays around a little bit, because if you come from the board op side, or running DMX everywhere, It's really interesting to kind of understand on the video side. Did I lose us? Oh, there we go. It's really interesting to see what the video side is dealing with, and I please ask, play with it, look at the streaming ACN handles, and give us feedback if there are things that you'd like to have in there. We want to support everybody working with their muscle memory and not having to change workflows. So it's really, really important to us. Another thing that I don't want to dive into because I think it's a very long technical discussion that probably all of us as panelists could talk about for hours, is the difference between color space and color gamut. I'll just mention kind of very quickly, color space is usually defining the colorimetry of like source content and also the gamma or the EOTF that it's been set to do. So that might, for SDR, gamma 22 be saying this is BT709. And what that defines is not just the color, but the gamma and other attributes for the signal and the color and the transform functions. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that when you send that data to a given lighting fixture or a given LED panel that it will be able to reproduce those. And so that's where color gamut comes into play. Gamut is the actual achievable colors of that device, and they don't always match one-to-one. And that's, again, why we require all of these special calibration tools, is because they generally don't match. In an ideal world, I think it was mentioned earlier, we would love for camera sensors to see ACES CG, and we'd love for every LED panel and lighting fixture to be able to output that gamut as well so that they would all be matched. But the technology is just not quite there yet. It'll be a little time before we get there. So related to color gamut and color space, this is another QR. We're publishing next week a white paper specifically talking about color in film production. And again, this is not the end-all be-all, but it's our opinion of where to get started thinking about color management for these things. And so this is a sneak peek. This will give you a link to a PDF that you can look at on your phone or download, and it's got a lot of great vocabulary, good glossary in there, and a few graphs and information on how to discern between the two. So thank you.
Check. Thank you very much. Questions? Damn, that was so good. There was no question. You left them speechless.
Everybody's napping after that.
Okay, the tacos have taken effect. Nap time. Wake up! Oh, we have a question. Hang on. Here we go.
So just so I understand, so in your ideal world, the background display is controlled by one team. The lights lighting, the sort of mimic lights lighting talent is then operated by the lighting department on set in conjunction with whatever light fixtures that they are also using.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't think that I would specifically say that the right way to do it is one versus the other. It's that all of this technology is kind of converging. And so if you take a bunch of LED panels and you turn them into a ceiling, or you have the mimic fixture that can take streaming ACN but also do video playback, there isn't really a right answer. They're all kind of becoming one and the same. But we have a very strong standpoint of we don't want to limit it. We don't want to say, oh, well, the mimic tile plays video, so it's a video device, and we don't allow you to control it with streaming ACN. We think that there's a lot of value in being able to do both. Same thing for the ceiling. You've got, in this truck, we have the 1.3 millimeter ceiling. I mean, we could be watching a 4K HDR movie on this, right, for like a movie night. But you may look at it and say, well, it's a softbox, right? And I want to just control the whole thing with a lighting console because there's a truck driving down, a dirt road in the woods, and I want a lightning strike, right? And I can hit a button on my console and do that potentially a lot faster and easier and simpler than having to go and program a video layer and do all these kinds of things. And so we see everybody coming to the table with their own skill sets and their own way of working and not limiting where control stops and takes over somewhere else. We want people to be able to work together.
If that is the last question, then we have a question.
I guess to follow up on that, so when you were starting a project, who would be kind of your point of contact besides like the DP has the idea and how he wants it to look, and then you want the volume wall and the lights to kind of work together? Would you go to like the rigging gaffer, the programmer, the main gaffer?
That's a good question. I don't have a singular answer to that. I think it's different on a lot of different projects. You know, I would say a good first step is like to talk to a visual effects supervisor who is going to be not necessarily the person dictating color, but the person who has hired or is working with and overseeing the people that are looking at color. But I would argue that, and I think this is part of the reason for getting everybody here today, there isn't necessarily that dialogue happening right now. And so I think it's very important for you know, the cinematographer and a gaffer and somebody from VFX that's managing the color pipeline to all sit together and decide what you're going to do for the production.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
So I forget exactly how LEDs are working, but I thought they had like different filters for the RGB, so it's limiting what each one puts out, and then in combination they produce the color. So the D65, what is that? How's that a different type of diode, I guess, from the RGB diodes?
Very good question. So typically LED technology was developed for producing the most efficient light from an energy perspective. And so for making a display of RGB, the wavelengths are extremely narrow, which don't look good for lighting, but they're very effective to make a television that you look at with your eyes, right? Because you can actually tune the colors of LEDs to be what your brain perceives as specific colors. However, when the LEDs are actually fabricated, it's a chemical process and fabrication that actually creates a native wavelength of red or a native wavelength of green. And so when you apply electricity to that LED, it just produces one color. That's it. And so by obviously combining different levels of RGB, we can get a perceived white, even though if we look at it under a microscope, it's really RGB turned on. When we talk about white LEDs, it's not really the same technology because we're not emitting white directly from electricity. We're energizing usually like an ultraviolet or a blue LED that's producing a specific wavelength, and then it's coated in phosphor, which is getting excited, and the phosphor is actually what glows. So very similar to a fluorescent tube, where the tube is coated with the phosphorus material on the inside of the glass, and that gets excited by the electricity and then glows. So it's actually quite a different technology, but the electricity going into it is doing the same thing.
What technical pitfalls have you encountered or that are worth looking out for with regards to power or cable management or operating environment like temperature, things like that?
That's a good question. LEDs are extremely sensitive to temperature. So if you put an LED wall into full white and you come back in an hour, it will probably be a different color temperature. Some processing systems and some upstream systems can account for those things, and other ones don't. One of the more typical ways that the LEDs are calibrated, and like in our case, for example, the way that I can actually change between Rec 709 and Rec 2020 is that I understand what the colorimetry is of every red, every green, and every blue subpixel of every pixel in the entire array, and that all can come back into one central point to then disseminate the information back down. And those are all very complex methodologies in a lab environment to be able to read that colorimetry, but we read it at a very specific temperature. So we actually have a thermal probe that's like a little IR laser thermometer that's controlled by software, and the patterns on the LED tile that we record are also controlled by software, to where the reading of the metadata is actually happening at a very, very precise temperature. And usually we do that at about a 20 to 25% average picture level, because a scene like this, it's not full white, right? The tiles are not getting as hot as they could be. This is pretty typical, and so we take about 20% heat and power draw as our baseline. And then we can make adjustments if it gets a little too hot or a little colder, but we're moving a little bit instead of moving a lot.
Hey, I just wanted to add an additional answer to some of the first two questions that came up about who do I talk to at Color Pipeline.
Oh, please, we have Catherine Brilhart here, who is like genius person to answer some of these.
Yay. So it depends on the scale and size of your project, like Jeremy pointed out. But sometime, like in 2023 these days, you have a virtual production department usually, and a virtual production supervisor is the head of that department, and he's usually working on that color pipeline along with a DP and a visual effects supervisor, kind of from early stages. If you're on a much smaller project, it might be like the Magic Box crew or like an XR Studios crew, like an end-to-end solution or a team that's kind of helping you with that process and can either answer questions, make suggestions, or have that kind of squared away from you, like right when you walk into the studio. But then if you scale up and you're working on like a big feature film, you'll have a running department that's separate from the camera department and could be intertwined with visual effects, could be totally separate, that is figuring out that pipeline and working with everyone along the way, and may have their own small little crew. So it kind of just depends on the scale, but I just wanted to put that out there that there is a virtual production supervisor and department, and it's only been in the last 2 or 3 years that white papers and SMPTE documentation has been published on that. So just wanted to throw it out there.
Thank you for adding.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeremy. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Brilliant presentation. Thank you.